Go. Great. Okay, cheers. Yeah, hi, I'm Richard. I been living in London 10 years, but just moved to New Zealand like a month ago. So I'm coming to you from New Zealand. It is winter. It is 5:47 a.m. and it is still dark outside. So if I screw up on this talk at all, that's my excuse. But anyway, I'm here to talk to you today about what is best in life. So a bit about my background. I started out at university studying mechanical engineering, which I honestly hated. And I switched to studying philosophy, which I loved. And now it's more than 10 years later, and my official job title is front-end engineer. Go figure. So I'm a front-end engineer these days, but I usually refer to myself as a developer. I've always felt a bit uncomfortable with the title of engineer. Like I couldn't really put my finger on why. Maybe it felt like a bit like I was claiming some sort of prestige that I hadn't earned. I didn't complete my engineering degree or study computer science. I'm mostly self-taught, like many of you are, I'm sure. I like to think I'm reasonably okay at my job, but I still feel like I'm hacking things together a lot of the time. Back in the day, many of us who build websites used to call ourselves webmasters or webmistresses, which I still think is an amazing job title, by the way. I'm kind of sad that I didn't start my career quite early enough to have a webmaster role in the job history section of my CV. It's a bit like social justice warrior. Like, people use it as an insult, but frankly, I think it sounds kind of badass. Anyway, so we were webmasters and webmistresses. And then that title fell out of fashion and we became web developers. And now many of us have the very professional sounding title of front-end engineers. And I don't think that's a bad thing, or that we should stop calling ourselves engineers. You can call yourself whatever you want. Like, you can be a techno Viking or an agile pirate ninja riding a full stack glitter unicorn that makes you feel better. It's all great. But we used to be working on dinky little websites that were kind of thrown together. And now many of us are working on massive professional operations that form the financial backbone of multi-billion-dollar corporations. We've come a long, long way from being webmasters and webmistresses. But a lot of us are self-taught and didn't go through any standardized training process. And don't get me wrong, this is great. It helps ease barriers to entry. But as the industry gets more professional, it might be worth thinking about other trappings of professionalism. If we're going to call ourselves engineers, then there are ethical duties and codes of responsibility that go along with that title. 100 years ago, civil engineering was in a very similar situation to how the tech industry is now. As the Industrial Revolution receded behind them, engineers found new ways to use all the fancy new technologies that they had developed. They grew more sophisticated in their approach, and their projects ballooned in scale and complexity. But as these projects became more ambitious, there was an accompanying problem: a rise in major engineering disasters. The turn of the 20th century saw a wave of epic structural failures, including some massive bridge collapses, and also the Great Boston Molasses Flood, which you can see here, which, if I had to name my favorite disaster of all time, this would kind of have to be it, just for the mental image of a tsunami of liquid sugar, 50 feet high, traveling 35 miles an hour, consuming everything in its path. It's terrifying, but also like kind of delicious. Anyway, these disasters had a profound effect on the way the public saw engineering and forced engineers to confront their shortcomings. And as a result, they began to regulate themselves more intensely and established standardized industry codes of ethics. So what is ethics? Ethics is a branch of philosophy devoted to answering questions about what is best in life. Questions like, what is best? What is the good life? How should I live? And I know what you're thinking. I can just imagine the cogs in your software developer minds turning over. You're thinking, that's easy. What is best is both spaces and tabs and alternating lines. The good life is spending the entire sprint refactoring your teammates' code. One should live by outsourcing your job to India and spending all day on TikTok or Reddit, Twitter. How should I behave towards other people? Interrupt them when they have their headphones on. And the purpose of life is obviously replacing everything with JavaScript. You're all monsters. Moral issues can get us pretty worked up. Think of abortion and euthanasia for starters. Because these are such emotional issues, We often let our hearts do the arguing, while our brains just go with the flow. But there are other ways of tackling these issues, and that's where philosophers can come in. They offer us ethical rules and principles that enable us to take a cooler view of moral problems. So, much like React provides us with a framework to help us handle DOM interactions, ethics provides us with a moral framework that we can use to find our way through difficult issues. And just as we have many different competing JavaScript frameworks like Vue or Angular, Svelte, and so on, there are many different moral theories like consequentialism, deontology, or virtue ethics. Learning about these different frameworks can help you better understand the way you think about morality, but it's not necessary for us to go into them in depth right now in order to be able to tell right from wrong. Philosophers like to do things called thought experiments, which are like real experiments, only better, because you never need to get out of your armchair. One of the most famous is the trolley problem. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with it. It's a reasonably cliche one these days, but for those of you who haven't heard about it, I'm just going to explain it briefly. Here's the deal. So there's a runaway trolley barreling down the railway tracks. Ahead on the tracks, there are 5 people tied up and unable to move. The trolley is headed straight for them. You're standing some distance off in the train yard next to a lever. If you pull this lever, the trolley will switch to a different set of tracks. However, you notice there is one person on the side track. You have 2 options. Do nothing, and the trolley kills the 5 people on the main track. Pull the lever, diverting the trolley on the side track where it will kill 1 person. Which one's the most ethical choice? So this is the part of the talk where I would normally have an interactive part where have to do a quick show of hands, but we're doing this online, so I'm just going to post a message on the Discord. Feel free to respond, react with a thumbs up or thumbs down, whether you would throw the lever or not throw the lever. And I'll come back and check your answers later. No wrong answers. Now, imagine instead of a switch, you're standing on a bridge over the tracks next to an extremely large man. The trolley is coming, and the only way you can stop it is to push the large man onto the tracks. He's the only one big enough to slow down the trolley. He's looking you right in the eyes. He can see what you're thinking, and he's terrified. He's begging you not to do it. What do you do? Again, I'm going to check a question in the comments and on the Discord. Feel free to respond. I'd be interested to see your responses. But generally, when I've done this in person, I've found that actually, so the trolley problems have been the subject of many surveys, which tend to find that approximately 9 out of 10 respondents would throw the switch to kill the 1 and save the 5. And that's been my experience when I've seen, done a show of hands in person. However, in the large man scenario, this situation often reverses, and only 1 in 10 people will push him onto the tracks. Incidentally, a 2009 survey of professional philosophers found that only 68% of them would throw the switch, 8% would not switch, and the remaining 24% had another view or could not answer. So if you're ever tied to a train track by a cartoon villain, you'd better hope that the person by the switch isn't a moral philosopher. So why the difference in the 2 outcomes? One theory is that it's because 2 different parts of your brain are fighting with each other. Some researchers looked at people's brains using fMRI machines and demonstrated that personal dilemmas, like pushing a man off a footbridge, engage brain regions associated with emotion, whereas impersonal dilemmas, like diverting a trolley by flipping a switch, engaged regions associated with controlled reasoning. And these different brain processes essentially compete with each other whenever you try to make a tough moral decision. Basically, inside your brain, you've got a monkey and a robot fighting over the controls. Every time you try to make a moral decision, they duke it out. The monkey understands something simple, like pushing someone off a bridge, and it's horrified. But it doesn't understand something complex like a mechanical switch. So in that situation, the gut response is reduced, and we're able to throw the lever without feeling such a crushing sense of moral horror. Now, some people have a stronger monkey, and some people have a stronger robot, and that's great, because both are useful in different situations. But this is kind of tricky for we programmers, because we work on complex, abstract problems, which might make it trickier for our monkey brains to trigger some kinds of moral responses. By the way, if you think that it's hard for programmers to experience the full range of ethical response, then spare a thought for autonomous vehicles. Self-driving cars don't have meat brains, and you can't make a perfectly ethical algorithm. You can only make it as good as the humans who programmed it. And we can't even agree on whether to use tabs or spaces. There is also some really tricky problems here that self-driving cars will face. Like, we'd prefer a self-driving car to swerve into a pile of trash rather than hit someone, just like a person might. But computers can make these kinds of decisions much quicker than we can. So if we decide in advance what we want them to do, they'll follow our instructions. So we'd probably want to program our car to hit a single adult rather than a busload of children, right? But what if the adult is a Nobel Prize-winning cancer researcher? What if the adult is driving the car? Would we want the car to sacrifice its driver? And would you choose to buy a self-driving car that's designed to sacrifice your life to save others? Some researchers at MIT came up with a pretty nice solution for this. They built an app to mine data on people's answers to different trolley problems, so they can use it to help them decide how autonomous cars should behave in different scenarios. The website is called Moral Machine, and you can go there right now and start judging scenarios, just like this one. So in this one, you have to choose between a male athlete driving a car and a jaywalking baby. On the one hand, the baby probably doesn't know not to cross on a red signal, but on the other hand, it might grow up to be Hitler, so it's a tough call. And it turns out that we're collectively pretty bad at these sorts of moral calculations. After concluding their Moral Machine study, MIT released some of their results, and we can learn 3 things from their data. Firstly, people would prefer that criminals die in car accidents rather than dogs, but they value the lives of criminals vastly over cats. Secondly, BBC viewers still clearly prefer the previous incarnations of Doctor Who. I think personally it's sexist, but can't argue with the data. Thirdly, in the future, it would be wise to walk around wearing a stethoscope in lab coat so you're not murdered by a self-driving car. Anyway, Moral Machine is a cool idea, but it doesn't help us because we can't outsource all of our ethical decision-making to the internet. We're just individuals working on our laptops, and we have these ridiculous meat brains, and we have to make our own decisions about whether to kill baby Hitler. So sometimes we make the wrong call. Now let's shift gears a minute and consider the Volkswagen emissions scandal. You may recall that VW added special software to millions of diesel cars that would detect when their exhaust fumes were being checked by emissions regulators and change performance to pass these tests. As a result, they managed to completely bypass emission standards in the US, EU, and elsewhere for a period of about 5 years. Their workaround allowed them to emit up to 40 times more nitrogen oxide than what the US emission standards allow. By some estimates, air pollution causes around 40,000 early deaths per year in the UK alone. So it's pretty safe to assume that Volkswagen's technical hack is likely to result in several thousand premature deaths, plus thousands more cases of asthma and other lung disease. And as someone who recently contracted asthma in the last few years, quite possibly due to London's air pollution, I took it kind of personally. So when I heard when I heard a few years ago that one of the engineers at VW was in prison for his role in the scandal, I thought, good. But on the other hand, I've got to give credit where it's due. VW's defeat device is a pretty brilliant technical hack. It's ingenious. I've got to imagine that if the engineers who created it must have felt pretty proud of themselves at the time. I can imagine myself being in that situation, feeling pretty smug about it. But at the same time, you also wonder why nobody spoke up at one of their internal meetings to say, hey, pals, do you think maybe we're being complete assholes here? How did they get it so wrong? Are they just inherently bad people? Maybe it's because the monkey part of their brain was completely unable to deal with the complexity of the problem. You've got cars, software hacks, and air pollution, and then decades later, some people you don't know might die. It's all a bit much for the poor monkey to handle. We established earlier that ethical reasoning involves an internal struggle for control. And a weird thing about humans is that we sometimes actually forget to act ethically when we're so focused on achieving a goal that we forget to think about the consequences of our actions. Or else, we justify it to ourselves in ways that don't stand up to scrutiny, but never stop to properly reflect. I'm sure we've all done this at some point. I definitely have, and it's led to some of my biggest screw-ups. When you're looking at a wall of code, it's very easy to forget about the humans who will be affected by your decisions, IRL. And unlike civil engineering, it's usually pretty easy for us to fix mistakes. You just roll out a patch or an update. In tech, we like to move fast and break things, but we don't want to move fast into oncoming traffic and break people. I think the monkey brain is a factor in many of the biggest ethical lapses in tech today. Whether it's Facebook enabling fake news, or Equifax with their criminally sloppy security, or just JavaScript devs being too lazy to bother making their websites accessible for disabled people and keyboard users. I want to believe that the people making these decisions are doing so because they're not thinking hard enough about the consequences and the people affected by their actions. However, there are also those who say, hey, I don't know about all the ethics stuff. I'm just an engineer. It's not my responsibility. Like Mr. von Braun here, who knew he couldn't be in the forefront of rocket research in Nazi Germany if he didn't go along. And he didn't care what crimes to turn a blind eye to, as long as he was allowed to play with his rockets. So to be clear, nobody is exempt from having to behave ethically. Scientists and engineers aren't a special group that get to be amoral and don't have to think about this stuff. Ethics contaminates everything. Whether you're building rockets or designing algorithms to help police identify gang members, you have a duty to consider how they might be used. With so many examples of ethically compromised decision-making in tech, it's easy to get pessimistic. There is some good news, though. If it's easy for people to act unethically when they don't think about it, the flip side to this is that people tend to behave more ethically when you remind them to. And it can happen even when you do it in subtle ways. For instance, a group of researchers at Newcastle University found that just hanging up posters of staring human eyes in a cafeteria was enough to significantly change people's behavior. Over the course of a month, they found that it made people twice as likely to clean up after themselves. If just a poster of eyes can achieve that much, then imagine what else we could accomplish with a few well-placed reminders. I'm not saying that we should attach googly eyes all over our offices and computer screens, even though it would probably help me make better eye contact on Zoom calls and meetup talks. But I suspect it would also feel creepy, like being in a cartoonish surveillance state. Probably not a good idea. But if we want to establish an organizational culture where people tend to act morally, then I think the reminders can be a powerful tool to help us achieve this. I mentioned before that many industry bodies introduced formal codes of ethics in the early 20th century. These came along with more legal regulations and barriers to entry, which I don't think is good for our industry. But ethical codes are a great idea. They're a very good way to remind people to act ethically. Because basically when you tell people, hey, don't be a dick, they are less likely to be a dick. We already do this with codes of conduct on open source GitHub repositories and at conferences and other events, including You Got This, as Kevin mentioned earlier, which has a fantastic code of conduct on their website, which I encourage you all to read. We can do this at our organizations too. They don't have to be complicated. In fact, the simpler the better. The most important thing is to set appropriate expectations for ethical behavior. There are loads of other codes of ethics around that you can use as your inspiration, including the one for ACM, as Catherine mentioned earlier. Read over some of the different codes, discuss them with your colleagues, and think about what sort of ethical principles you choose for your own work, your team, or your company. You can use an existing code of ethics or borrow different aspects and make your own. Once you've chosen an ethical code, communicate it with your team. How you communicate it is up to you. For example, you could include it in your onboarding for new starters. Add ethical checks to checklists and documentation for new projects. Run internal publicity campaigns. The important thing is that it becomes part of your team and company culture. The act of communicating expectations is important for empowering team members to speak up if they're uncomfortable before it's too late. A few years ago, I was working for a consultancy who assigned me to a website project for a client that I didn't approve of. But I got so invested right away in solving the technical aspects of the project that I didn't stop to think about whether I was morally okay working for this client until I was already deeply invested. I moaned about the client to some colleagues over a drink, and they told me, hey, Richard, like if you didn't want to work for this client, that's fine, but you should have said something at the start of the project. It made me realize that it was okay to say no to client projects, but also that the appropriate time to do that is before you start work. The later you leave it, the harder it is to say no. The next time a dodgy client came along, I felt more comfortable expressing my concerns up front, and we ended up turning down the client. If we establish and reinforce team norms that it's okay to speak up when you're uncomfortable, then we can help each other avoid these kinds of situations. I tend to think of this as being a bit like encouraging developers to submit bug reports and point out problems in your applications or processes. If everyone feels empowered to speak up, then you're all better off. By the way, Kevin tells me that next month's meetup is going to include at least one talk about how to say no. So if this is something you're interested in, definitely attend that one. On a related note, if you speak up about ethically dubious practices at your workplace and your employer doesn't listen, you may have a duty to report it to the authorities or otherwise make it public. A basic dilemma in engineering ethics is that an engineer has a duty to their client or employer, but an even greater duty to report a possible risk to others from a client or employer failing to follow the engineer's directions. A classic example of this is the Challenger space shuttle disaster. NASA engineers raised warnings about the faulty O-rings in the boosters and the dangers posed by the low temperatures on the morning of the launch. But managers disregarded these warnings and failed to adequately report these technical concerns to their supervisors. It was later argued that in these circumstances, the engineers had a duty to circumvent their managers and shout about the dangers until they were heard. I mentioned building ethics checks into processes as a regular reminder to encourage ethical thinking as early as possible. A friend who works as a psychotherapist tells me that their training includes ethics checks as a core part of their process. So whenever they're trying to make a tough decision, they have these questions they can use, which are designed to trigger different types of emotional responses. So you've got this first one here. Would you be happy for everyone to know the decision you've made? Which I think is quite a monkey brain question. It's a good one for triggering emotional responses like shame. For example, if you're considering being lazy about making your website accessible, imagine there's a disabled person sitting next to you and think about whether you'd be comfortable explaining your code choices to them. The second one here, do you think the consequences are acceptable? Seems designed to trigger more of a consequentialist response, like a bit more utilitarian. It's maybe a bit of a rationalist robot brain approach. The last one here, would you recommend the same course of action to others? Reminds me of Kant's categorical imperative. So you should do, which is that you should only do something if you would be okay with it being a universal law. So that's cool too, if Kant's your thing. I think these are all a great start, and feel free to build off them or tailor them to your own work. Finally, we can help engineers to develop more empathy for their users by encouraging them to meet them in person. A great way to do this is to get devs to sit on in user testing sessions. A nice additional benefit of this is that empathy for your users helps you design better user-centered solutions too, so it's win-win. These ideas are just a start. They won't fix everything. Like, they won't stop the fact that a small handful of mega corporations own our digital lives and strip mine them for profit, but one step at a time. As webmasters and webmistresses, we each have the power to help shape the web. As Catherine said earlier, and like OG Webmaster Spider-Man says, we have to remember that this power comes with a great responsibility to do the right thing. Thanks. Happy to answer any questions you might have.